I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's version of the Washington University Sam School Lecture Series. Tonight we're lucky to have Shantel Blakely, assistant professor here, who has been taking over a lot of the history teaching. She's now teaching Architectural History 1 and 2. She has also a very distinguished scholarly background. She previously taught at various places in New York and Boston. She has a PhD in architecture from Columbia and an MArch from Princeton and a MA in philosophy from Tufts, and also an undergraduate degree from Harvard College. She also was awarded a Richard Rogers Fellowship to study Herbert Reed, the publicist or actually critic of modern architecture in England, and has also worked in various architects' offices, including Mary Ann Thompson Architects in Boston. She says, through a scholarly engagement with architecture, she has sought to understand and explain forms of monumentality and configuration that have motivated architects since antiquity, and that organizes a lot of her scholarly work. Her main focus in terms of her current project is on Marco Zanuso, an Italian avant-garde architect of the mid-century who worked extensively for Olivetti, the typewriter manufacturer once very well known around the world, and also patron of the arts, very significant sort of force in modern Italian design right after World War II. And she's especially interested in Zanuso's work as a mode of resistance to systemic economic pressure in Italy toward an isolating professional specialization. And so I think a lot of her work is engaged was trying to think about the role of designers broadly understood, not just in architecture, but in related fields, such as, especially in Zanuso's case, furniture design as well. She's published essays in various places, AA Files, Plot, Log, other journals, and she's also currently working on a project on Charles Fleming, the first Black architect to graduate from the School of Architecture, that we're working on together, and interviewing Charles Fleming, who's still alive today in his 80s. So in many ways, Shantel is making, I think, very important contributions to the field and to this school, and we're very happy to welcome her here tonight.
Thank you, Eric, for that introduction. And thank you to Professor McCarter and to all of you who've come to hear the lecture. What I will present is something of a work in progress. So I am not sure how it's going to come across, but I would actually be really interested to hear your responses in the question and answer session that will follow. So let me just start it here. In post-war Italy, and that by post-war in this talk, I'll be referring to World War II. Old ways of life were unsettled by massive social transformations. The expansion of the industrial and service sectors of the economy brought new kinds of clerical jobs. Women entered the workforce in larger numbers than before. And there were other changes as well. And these changes provoked a range of attitudes. The period is not that extensively studied in the US, but you may be familiar with, for example, Elena Ferrante's novels about young women growing up in Naples. This was taking place during the 1960s when they're suddenly confronted with a wider range of options for education. And while they have the opportunity to pursue a kind of life that their parents may never have had, they also faced unexpected moments of opposition as those around them were reluctant to embrace these new possibilities. The post-war period in Italy was also characterized by uneven economic development, and there were widespread internal migrations. Within a decade, hundreds of thousands of people began to move from southern and rural areas into the industrial centers in the north. cities changed and new problems arose, including chronic work shortages. And in the field of architecture, speculative building largely without the involvement of architects in planning or design. So while there is a heroic aspect in the literature and in the history of this period, there's also in other examples a sense of aporia of a life having arrived at a place from which it's impossible to move forward. Aporia means impasse. And Italian architects who associated with the modern movement, of which Milan was a central sort of hub, faced their own kinds of impasse. I'm showing you a slide of the cover of the book Milano Oggi, Milan Today, which was a sort of coffee table book that surveyed the city of Milan, edited by Gio Ponti, featuring many new buildings and so forth, a kind of cheerleading for the new city. Italian architecture had many critics. It was a kind of, in Milan, there was an organization called the Study Movement for Architecture, which was the modernist architects, and they maintained a lively discussion and debate. And critics are sort of emerged in this context, and they were ambivalent about the kind of progress that modern architecture had been able to make in that context. In a 1972 essay about the Italian modern movement, Vittorio Gregotti, who you see at center here, wrote that modernist architects in Milan began to mobilize between 1946 and 1948 around the idea of providing elegant, simple designs for buildings, homes, furniture, ready for production as the nation began to rebuild after the ravages of Allied bombings and German occupation. But the possibility of architects' involvement in the design of the new Italian home was limited by several factors, any one of which would have been enough. But they sort of redundantly foreclosed this sort of grand view ambitions being realized. The architects failed to envision a rationalized production system that might have enabled them to produce and distribute the furniture and designs that they were producing. The Italian consumer was resistant to the modern aesthetic and instead valued decoration and traditional motifs as symbols of luxury. And the structure of the new government, which formed its own agencies of planning and industrial policy, mostly included the architects in the sort of modernist circle. The cities were transformed more often by speculative building than by architect-guided projects. Designers lamented the persistence of production of furnitures and objects and weak imitations of past styles. And the effect of this sort of situation was that architecture became more and more a kind of insular and intellectual world by the 1960s, partly due to its own characteristics, partly due to circumstances beyond its control. Some of the strongest architects built modernist buildings that, however, had no implication for the next building that might go next to it, for example. So a criticism that was leveled against the Pirelli Tower, which you see here in a photograph, which was constructed in the late 1950s, was that it had essentially no urban plan attached to it. It was like an object that just sprang up there. And meanwhile, in the Velasca Tower, it's a sort of skyscraper designed by the BPPR and sort of elaborated in a style reminiscent of medieval castles. It's a kind of deliberate polemic, at least in Gregotti's view, that sort of says, this is sort of answers to the public taste by saying, this is what you like, well, here, this is what it looks like as a skyscraper. And Gregotti sort of lamented this in his writings in the around 1972, that the circumstance that isolated architects tended to make them more isolated because they turned to these either thought of their buildings as a kind of isolated object or became involved in sort of polemical theses that no longer had any chance of being sort of more widely influential. So that's part of what makes this a really interesting period to study, that there are these debates, there are these criticisms, they're so deep, the architects were so passionate and if not necessarily optimistic, one of the critic on the right in the slide, a couple slides back, was Manfredo Tafuri, a Marxist who actually advanced a very pessimistic assessment of the modern movement, affectionate but not exactly encouraging. At least there was this sort of endless ferment and thought going on. And it has to be said that even though this was in general a period of impasse, perhaps that only seems to be the case measured against the kind of heroic ambitions of the modern movement, which one might say weren't like spectacularly successful in transforming reality anywhere. There were many strong projects that emerged in Italy during this time period, perhaps as a side effect of that very ferment. Architects engaged ideas in architecture, and some of them tried to solve technical problems, and particularly to look to the technical realities of architecture as a way to anticipate what would be the architecture to come. So the two architects that I will talk about today, Marco Zanuso and Angelo Mangiarotti, were both in that category of architects who turned to technology. And I'll talk about two projects that were both completed around 1960. I'd like to take a close look at the approach of these two architects to designing buildings, in particular concrete structures, and to focus on the fragment and the joint in these projects, because it promises a kind of close reading, but also because these projects happen to sort of be all joint. They're rather a small set of parts articulated together. So the joint is kind of the heart of these projects. So my goal is to try to find terms with which describe and differentiate the signature of each architect. As Eric kindly mentioned, my research, part of my research focuses on Marco Zanuso. And my interest as a historian is to understand the particular way in which he developed architecture out of the materials he worked with within the given constraints. Comparing his work to other similar architects is a method for trying to become more articulate about his work. So just to say a little bit about these two, Angelo Mangiarotti was born in 1921, and he attended the Milan Polytechnic, which is the architecture school in Milan, graduated in 1948, so just a couple of years after the Second World War ended. He went on to spend time working in the US between 1953 and 54, and then returned to Italy, where he established an architecture firm with Bruno Morasutti, a fellow architect. While he was in the US, he met Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, and Konrad Wachsmann. He actually taught in the US for some time. But the latter part of his career was spent in Italy and also in Japan. Marco Zanuso was somewhat older. He too studied at the Milan Polytechnic, graduated in 1939. So that's almost 10 years before Mangiarotti, but Zanuso immediately upon graduation went into the Navy, and he too started his career just after the war ended. The building that we'll talk about is his factory for Olivetti in Argentina. It's actually just outside Buenos Aires, and it was built between 1953 and 1962. Mangiarotti's project, it's a warehouse building that was built at Padua, was constructed in 1959. So they're roughly contemporary projects. Both architects were preoccupied with technical problems and each developed a kind of style around them. So one of these problems was how to produce buildings at this large scale with parts that were prefabricated or that were fabricated by serial methods on site. So often prefabrication in this context didn't mean necessarily manufacturing at a factory and bringing to the site, but casting parts in concrete in series. And secondly, how to confront the necessities of structural form or of technical equipment in the design of these buildings. Both of these architects developed expertise in concrete buildings in particular. And I have a kind of hypothesis or a kind of tentative way of characterizing these two approaches that I'd like to look at in greater depth. And I know I can't say that I really have gotten to the bottom of this difference, but I do hope to maybe just put the problem on the table. In general, I'd like to say, I'm thinking about whether I would characterize Zanuso's approach as one of collage. And on the other hand, to characterize Mangiarotti's approach in terms of the assimilation of structure to a figure. Now that in particular, both of these have allusions to, let's say, visual art. And so a sub-theme of my talk is this relationship between architecture and art, and particularly the status of this relationship in the historiography of modern architecture, in the representation of modern architecture in general by the 1950s, and in particular, the significance that art had in terms of the relationship between visual arts and architecture, painting, sculpture, and architecture in Italy. This is an image of Pablo Picasso's bottle of Vieux Marque glass guitar and newspaper. I've chosen it as a kind of sort of an example that for me sort of sums up Picasso's collage style, or the Cubist collage style. It's, I'm thinking here of the historian Siegfried Giedion, who wrote Space, Time, and Architecture. And I'd add that if my students are in the audience, they're probably rolling their eyes at this point. But Giedion characterized the origination of modern architecture in terms of a kind of co-emergence along with Cubist painting. In particular, he wrote about the artist's ability to see an aspect of art in ordinary things, such as a guitar or a newspaper, that this ability enabled the artist to fashion works of art out of the materials of the contemporary world. The art of collage was part of what enabled Cubist painters to create works that would be symbols for their historical moment. Here's a page from Space, Time, and Architecture where Giedion has put an image of a Picasso collage. He writes about this theme. Painters like Picasso, Juan Gris, and Le Corbusier have devoted themselves to the common objects of daily use: bowls, pipes, bottles, glasses, guitars. Anonymous and unpretentious things like these scarcely figure at all in our normal consciousness, but they attain their true stature and significance under the artist's hand. And Giedion represented the the modernist architect in similar terms. Just a page or two after that, he shows us images of a work by Kazimir Malevich and by Theo van Doesburg and Cor van Eesteren, showing how the sort of lineaments or the sort of graphic or compositional style of Cubism or of de style painting was interpreted in the architecture as well. According to Giedion, the modernist architect, like the Cubist painter, had the ability to handle new materials in such a way that they were infused with architectural presence in the fullest sense. Architectural form seen in this way could be a source of reassurance in the face of change. Space-Time in Architecture was published in 1939, but in the 1950s, the theme of architecture and art, and especially architecture, mural art, and sculpture, continued to be explored. And this is just images from the book, The Synthesis of the Arts by Paul Demaz, Art in European Architecture, which circulated widely in the mid-1950s. And on the left, the far left is actually one of Zanuso's projects. Was a showroom for a linoleum company that was featured in Demaz's book. And this is kind of a reflection of another aspect of Zanuso, his actual engagement with artists. This book, Synthèse des Arts, dealt with the incorporation of artworks into architecture. And what I'm talking about, on the other hand, in looking at these buildings, is more like an analogous practice that's analogous between architects and artists. And this is not, they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, the factory that Zanuso designed for Olivetti had a stone artwork inside it. So it fit right into this paradigm. I'm not going to go any further in depth about Zanuso in today's talk, because I want to get on to the comparison. But this is just to say that theme of art and architecture, of what art can do, being a model for what architecture can do, was very much alive in the context, in the Italian context, and also the general wider European and American post-war architectural context. In Italy, as elsewhere, the idea Gideon had put on the table, and others as well, Le Corbusier had picked it up, returned in various writings, talks, conversations, practices. The visual arts were represented as particularly important amenities for the public because of rebuilding and the need to rebuild in a way that would create a stimulating environment and not a sort of dead, generic one. But also art was considered as a means for those who had lived through the war to come to terms with trauma. So the artist was kind of, by making art, one kind of healed oneself and created an environment that was friendlier to others as well. But Italy was also undergoing industrialization in earnest for the first time after World War II. So just as Germany had experienced industrialization in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and England somewhat earlier even, Italy had remained mainly an agricultural economy right up until World War II. So there was rapid change, but this is just to say that those arguments in the culture of modern architecture that were maybe not quite passé, but being sort of pushed aside by other considerations in other countries, in Italy were still very relevant in a very current way. So perhaps that helps to account for the way that in the first sort of resurgence of architecture culture after World War II, this theme of art was very present. So I'm showing you a cover of Domus magazine from that period of about 2 years, in which it was edited by Ernesto Nathan Rogers. In fact, Zanuso was a sub-editor in this period. It featured the work of Max Bill and Alvar Aalto, who you see on the left. And the implication was that there's a sort of there's a continuity here. Well, this is actually on the right, you're seeing a sculpture that was called Continuity, which, so Max Bill was known for his works, which are typically characterized as constructivist, which is to say that the artwork was based on an actual mathematical formula, or at least that's how it was presented. not necessarily a formula, but very specific geometrical shapes. And on the left, you have this sort of circular stool, which Alto has designed to be made out of bent plywood. So the suggestion is that there's art and architecture or design are somehow very close. The same kinds of parallels were being made between these artworks and architecture. So there's a kind of ideal architect that's hovering around many conversations about architecture in Milan after the war, who is someone who could interpret the new means of buildings, technologies, programs, and a part of that interpretation was sort of making them expressive. Now, Marco Zanuso and Angelo Mangiarotti were both among the architects who were measured against this ideal. In fact, they were probably among the very top architects in that regard, people who would have been pointed to as examples of what architecture could be. And so given that, I'm very interested to understand to what extent can we make sense of this idea that they sort of made technology and architecture expressive? In what sense were these joints expressive? So, Zanuso. This is a page spread from the book, The Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment by the British critic Rayner Banham. Banham is perhaps one of, if not the only critic outside Italy who gave a kind of very direct, sustained attention to Zanuso's work. And most of his writings on Zanuso revolved around this particular project, the factory for Olivetti in Argentina. At the time, Banham was writing quite a bit about the problem of how architecture could assimilate technologies, particularly technologies of ventilation. And Banham had a particular way of formulating the issue, which is to say, he believed that architects needed to be in dialogue with tradition in order to make architecture. And this kind of plays out in what he says about Zanuso. Now, Banham wasn't someone who, like Gideon, considered architecture to be like an art form along with painting and sculpture. He was more interested in what would more precisely be called the tectonic or architectonic aspect of architecture, or even one could say in the rhetoric of architecture. So visibility for Banham wasn't what it was for Gideon, which was that you looked at this thing and you saw a symbol of your time, and it was an art experience of looking at art. For Banham, at least the way he described the architecture, looking at the architecture was kind of like reading. It was a matter of apprehending the content of the architecture and the intentions of the architect. In writings about concrete brutalist architecture, which he wrote a book about, The New Brutalism, and in writing about architecture that engaged with technological apparatuses like air conditioning units, he often referred, for instance, to the relationship of modern architecture to 19th century French academic architectural theory. So, for instance, in The New Brutalism, he wrote about the Hunstanton School by Allison and Peter Smithson. And you can see in this plan that I've copied from his book that it was symmetrical. So part of its charm lay in the fact that at the end of the day, although it was in some respects kind of aggressively modernistic in its use of materials. Fundamentally, the architects were doing something analogous to what architects had always done, which is they had laid out things in an organized way so that you could make sense of them. And that they had done all of this in a new set of programs, that they kind of resolve the programmatic project into an organized, visibly organized whole. And he sees the same kind of control, as he will go on to call it, in Zanuso's factory for Olivetti at Buenos Aires. So Banham mentions the Cross of Lorraine, as he calls it, which is a cross figure that's sort of double cross. You can see it on the lower right there. And then that's to say that the plan of the factory, which is represented in an early model, a model of a very early version, above right, that it has this logic, essentially. It's not necessarily the Beaux-Arts logic, but it is organized. And so, so this is what he would praise Zanuso's work for. It didn't just solve a technical problem, it visually communicates the cohesiveness of the architecture and its commitment to meeting needs. And the project happened to include these massive air conditioning ducts. Actually, in this particular early version of the project, there was a huge, a giant air handling unit, and this was a huge duct that would blow air down here. So Zanuso somehow manages to resolve all of this into something that can be recognized as architecture, with its differentiation of parts and the nature and function of each part being apparent. So something more than visual experience is at stake for Banham in this way of looking at architecture. And the language in which Banham describes Zanuso's design in The Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment is rich in allusions to emotional experience. So he says, neither Albini's nor Kahn's designs, his other designs that he's comparing, like grouping with Zanuso's, neither of these have this frank and gratifying clarity. He writes that the design seems to satisfy a deep intellectual and moral need, the need to be able to see the difference between the structure, which is supposed to be permanent, and the services, which are hoped to be transient, and to see that difference made expressive. Just going to go back. So, so what he's referring to there is that this concrete part of the building is forever, right? I mean, it's for the life of the building. But this mechanical part, maybe, I'm not sure if those buildings are, the building is still existing. One would actually, it'd be very interesting to see if these air handling units are still there or if they've been replaced. But in principle, equipment evolves faster than buildings crumble. I mean, that's what one hopes. That's sort of what the problem was to Banham's mind. And so he praises this solution because it allows for that differential timing, the different time lifespan of the equipment versus the structure. And all of this is just seen to be deliberate and it's apparent to the viewer. So this is what Banham valued. And Banham describes the factory of Buenos Aires, but we can see something comparable in Zanuso's other designs. Showing you one. This is an image of his factory for Olivetti at Sao Paulo, which was built roughly at the same time as the one in Argentina. Completely different, and it has these columns actually now serving as the ventilators. Maybe I should go back and just explain that the whole principle of this building is something like this. So you have the column, and then there's a grid of columns. You can see them here, grid, and these bays enclosed by glass. The beam is actually hollow and accommodates a duct. And then the roof joists are on top of that beam. And then the canopy sits on top of the joists, and all of this is in concrete. So the achievement of this design is that this air handling unit, and there are many of them, there's one for each bay, is simply clipped onto the end. And So this was Zanuso's first design, which had a massive duct. It happened that the project was put on hold because, well, there was a coup d'etat in Argentina and Olivetti had to cease operations there for a while. And in the meantime, he started the project at Sao Paulo. And in the course of that period of a few years, he started to think differently about the Buenos Aires design and eventually redesigned the beams to be hollow. And so there would be, let's say, 30 or however many of these little bays there would be this many air handling units. And as the factory expanded, more could be built and more air handling units just clipped on. So he was able to do away with this giant duct and the giant air handling unit, and to allow for the structure to be built in the same way in perpetuity. So that's the genius of the design. And so it's similar, but interestingly enough, Zanuso was not an architect who did the same thing again and again. So in the Sao Paulo, his solution is quite different. The ventilation is in the columns rather than the beams. There aren't really beams here. There are these sort of shells made of tiles tensioned by wires and pasted over with concrete. The ventilation was in the columns. So the ducts were just short things and the fans sat on the top of the roof. So the structures are completely different, but they both have the same kind of clarity where you understand how the different parts go together. So that's my hypothesis about Zanuso. It's a kind of collage. And even I think the way that there's sort of white space, the way negative space is used to accommodate these different things, there are negative spaces in this design as well. This sort of space between the canopy and the air handling unit, between the flange on the edge of the beam and the roof joist. There's a lot of space within these details, empty, open space. But what Banham emphasizes, again, is the fact of servicing is seen to be within the architect's control, even if what is seen is not in detail entirely of the architect's design. So just as this fragment has printing that's from the newspaper that Picasso did not make, this building has this parts that are, he did not design. He had no control over their design, but somehow this method of making them all seem as though they belong together. In fact, you could compare this to like a car, which has a kind of shell, it has wheels. Somehow it makes sense. Here's a truck. This is why I wanted to characterize Zanuso's approach as collage. So here are just a few more images of the structure with showing the many places where there are spaces around the parts. Even the columns are these double pieces. And the effect, so the details are all somehow serving a purpose. So the bend here helps to strengthen the edge, not necessarily in that case, but here where you see the plate of concrete is folded, that creates a flange, which actually strengthens the edge. And so there's a kind of clarity in the design. And as I tried to show the collage aesthetic, or what I'm calling the collage aesthetic. Interestingly enough, Zanuso's industrial design works do not show this quality at all. It's just his architecture. Here I'm showing a radio, two of his designs for Brie & Vega. Both of these were done along with the designer Richard Zapper. And it's interesting that in these designs, actually, there isn't that sense of the multiplicity of different kinds of things brought together. There's a frame that wraps around this panel where there's a dial and there are knobs and the speaker. Everything has more of a kind of predictable, organized, compact character. It's not collage at all. Similarly, the dummy television set, there isn't that aesthetic of showing us that these are different things that are brought together. I mean, sure, you can see that this is a metal part, and there's a, you know, an antenna, and this is a plastic casing. So there's that kind of clarity in that sense. But this is the screen, and this is the sort of back end of the cathode ray television. And from the front, you actually can't see the back end at all. And that suggests more an attitude of reducing away complexity by hiding it rather than showing it, which is what I'm saying is going on in his buildings. So now let me turn to Mangiarotti. So Angelo Mangiarotti, he wrote, I believe that a correct use of technology, the refinement of calculations, the use of materials in accordance with up-to-date knowledge are all elements which contribute to assure a work its proper place in historical perspective. It is certain that the structure remains a means for arriving at architecture and not vice versa. So the projects that we'll see were done in close collaboration with structural engineers. And that's his point here is just that he allowed this to become a kind of incentive and a kind of energizing circumstance that infused and informed the architecture. Instead of thinking, okay, I have to have a certain architectural form and then sort of reverse, you know, sort of figuring out how to make that happen with the structure. And then the interesting thing about, an interesting thing about Mangiarotti's design is that it's not all that clear. It's not actually not all that easy to, it's not that I don't believe him. It's just that when you read this, you understand what an incredible balancing act he and his team have walked, because the figure, as is my sort of hypothesis about Mangiarotti, the figure is actually very strong in his work. This is an image of a sculpture by Mangiarotti. Actually, I think it's two different sculptures. And I show it. It comes from an article by Francois Burkhardt, the design historian, who wrote about Mangiarotti, and this was published in Domus in 1998. And Burkhardt's argument was, Mangiarotti is a kind of artist, that this is a form of art, that he's a sort of polymath who's an artist as well as an architect. And so his article was called the artistic aspect in the work of Mangiarotti. But if I consider this this sculpture, especially the one on the left, it shows the drawing and then the sculpture. The relationship between the drawing and the sculpture is so literal that you might almost say that the block of stone, as you see it in the center here, in this first work, it's almost like become a canvas for a line drawing, a very beautiful line drawing. But if I compare this, then, I mean, I can appreciate this, but if I compare it to a contemporary artist, the actual sculptor per se, Andrea Cascella in this case, who was the artist who did the mural for Zanuso's factory in Argentina, it just seems that a work like this is much more sort of celebratory of the fact of it's being made out of stone, the fact that these are being jointed together. The joining in this case is simply a matter of revealing that there is a cut. We don't actually see the mechanism of the joint, but it's also just made to look as though it was punched and then slid off a little bit. Whereas in this case, on the right, the Cascella sculpture, it has forms that are sort of drawing the interlocking, and this isn't the whole of the joint. There is something hidden there, but there's a sense in which this this object here by, for example, taking the radius, a certain radius that's governed by the way stone can be cut. There's a sense that I get looking at this that suggests to me that the artist actually was energized and interested in the constraints and the possibilities of cutting stone and jointing stone. And then on the other hand, Mangiarotti's sculpture, it seems like the realization of a concept. Now, I'm not saying that to judge Mangiarotti's sculpture negatively, but I do wonder why Burckhardt would have us think about Mangiarotti as an artist. And also, this is not to say that I mean, it seems obvious that the figure and form is a preoccupation for Mangiarotti. And these are some examples of his lamp designs, also from the 1960s. But there's a certain joy that I see that coming out of these objects in terms of a kind of celebration of the form that the materials can make and the qualities of the materials. Here is where I feel there is this life, whereas the designer, he is somehow in dialogue or in some kind of energetic exchange with what he is doing that brings out possibilities, and those possibilities bring new possibilities, and he makes choices, and he goes, there's a sense of adventure and interest here, as there is in Cascella's sculpture, but not in Mangiarotti's sculpture, on my view, and just looking as far as that one example is concerned. And similarly, I would say similarly to this way of thinking about his design is somehow complete in itself and not really needing to be characterized as art. I would say that his architecture also seems to have this very strong figurative aspect to it, figural, like the figure, the line, the shape of things. It's clearly very important to Mangiarotti, and he was just a virtuoso. But I don't feel the need to say that this is art. Instead, that this is architecture, is a way of approaching architecture, and particularly a way that draws on that draws its energy in that sort of kind of gaining strength and power and impact, draws its energy from the circumstances of the architectural project that he was given. So this is an image of 1/8 of the roof of a warehouse project that he designed along with Morasuti and the structural engineer Aldo Favini. It was built in Mestre, which is the sort of landfall closest to Venice, right by the side of a canal. And it was made from 8 pieces like this that run the entire width of the eventual building, that were then fitted together and post-tensioned with cables. And you can see here that there are these, first of all, you can see a taper here. So this is an upside down piece of that roof. And so this is actually a beam. These are beams. And you can see here a couple of things, that the beam is tapering toward the end, or getting fatter toward the intersection, probably is the more relevant detail, because this is where the columns would sit, or this is where the beam would sit on the column. It's tapering in that direction. Also, you can't see so well here. Or you can see it here, actually. It gets narrower toward the top, toward the roof surface. This would probably be easier to see in the next slide. Here's the underside of the same roof system. So here you can see all of the pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that they sat on columns and that went sort of down their length, and then they were bound together by cables across that were then post-tensioned. And just on the right here is just a diagram of the Hennebeek system, which was had been sort of the the basis of modern architects' experiments in concrete, from Auguste Perret to Le Corbusier and the Maison Domino. And here too, you see how some of these, the thickness of the joint between the beam and the column is due to this intersection here. And you can see that happening in this structure as well, that there's more material around the joints. And the other detail is that the cables, or the cables inside the reinforced concrete, run along the bottom because they that is where the tension, the beam is in, the tension forces are acting on the beam. And in this picture, you can just see the structure once the formwork was taken down, the sort of raw concrete. But I just don't have a great picture of it, but these beams actually are fatter on the bottom and narrower on the top. They're fatter according to the fact that there are cables down there. And that's just the importance of that detail, is just that in a way, this project is in a way about the cable, because it's the sort of governing the shape of the concrete. You can almost see here the kind of width of the base of the beam. The cables inside are governing the width and dimensions of the pieces, even though we can't see them. And they're governing it in a very rational way, it's sort of logically consistent way. So the detail that I had pulled out for this comparison between Zanuso and Mangiarotti is this one here, which is taken from a project that Mangiarotti did for, this was an iron depository. So a place where at some stage in production, iron would be stored. I think for our purposes, it's a warehouse. So it has two bays, sort of across its width, and they run longitudinally. And its roof is sort of floating above that assembly. These columns are made out of cast concrete, and so are the beams. And the beams have this characteristic H shape. So in a sense, it may remind you of an I-beam, but again, there's space in between these two parts of the column and these two parts of the beams. And they're just tied together with these cross points here. So this was corrugated aluminum and glass on the facade. But essentially this one, like the Mestre warehouse, is a kind of concrete canopy and then enclosed around its sides. In this case, the ends are glass, and in some places the side walls are actually made of brick. The roof, which you can see the underside of here, was actually made out of sheet steel that was formed into hexagonal, so each piece would be like a half hexagon, and then they were clamped together like a sandwich. And then these lights you see are actually openings. They are steel cylinders that have been cut into the honeycomb structure across the tube. So the tube, and then it's like cut through it to let light down. So these are just skylights in effect. Here's an image of the plan. So this shows you, so we were looking at an elevation from this side. So here's the beams you can see. This actually, I think we are looking up at the roof from below. And so you can see how the columns cut are these double things, and how the tubes run across the width of the structure. This is a view along the long side. It's where so you can see the ends of the beams forming this kind of rhythmic pattern here. Very thin, because again, that's bent sheet steel. And then these little lenses on top cover those cylinders that I mentioned. earlier. So the whole of the interior is lit by this grid of lights. So here you see a view of that side wall. So you see the brick infill and the column again. That H-shaped beam produces this really elegant channel on the side, a kind of just graphic break in the height of that beam. And you can see the ends of those beams in the roof, essentially. The roof is essentially has its own beams. You can see the underside here of that and how there's a gap, a space between the roof and the top of the H based on the detailing. And you can see the lenses of the lights here as well. And at night, those were illuminated. So the factory presented itself from the street passing by as this like row of lights. Julia Veronesi, the historian who wrote a profile of Mangiarotti in Zodiac, described his work in terms of a kind of combination of the spirit of geometry and the spirit of refinement or subtlety. And this project is a good example. I hope if you're intrigued by Mangiarotti's work that you'll look at his other work as well. But this project has some of the kind of aspects of wonder that appear in many of his projects, including this detail that the roof seems to float above this wall. So just as in the case of Zanuso, there's this sense of lightness and space inside. So this basically concludes my talk. Just in summary, I just would say that we can see when we start to look closely at these two architects and the way that they design concrete structures, how they bring out a kind of expressive aspect in their work, and also we can see what their concerns were and how their architecture, what architecture is doing here. So like architecture is for one thing, making the fact that these parts are assembled together legible in the structure, showing you these parts and showing you that they are assembled, as Banham took pains to say. They serve to create a kind of language with them. Julia Veronesi, that was her way of describing what Mangiarotti achieved in his designs. That there's this like small, excuse me a minute, there's a train going by in the background. That these small parts are somehow combined in a consistent way that's syntactical, that creates a kind of language for the project. And we could perhaps agree with Gideon that these projects, both of these architects create these buildings that can be perceived and understood and experienced as symbols, symbols for modernity or modernization or for the industrial, particularly in the case of Zanuso, with the sort of very prominent display of the machine. And I would just add that, as I have argued, it's not necessary to conflate architecture with visual art. Although it may be important to understand that it is acting in some sense analogous. But in order to understand the architecture as such, it's necessary to understand how they make the project that fulfills the function and shelters the space and so forth. And at the risk of being overly sentimental, I will just end with a quote from Siegfried Gideon, who wrote, he wrote of the artist, but he also means the architects. The artist functions a great deal like an inventor or a scientific discoverer. All three seek new relations between man and his world. And as I understand Gideon, he's suggesting that by making a symbol, making like a factory that's also kind of emblematic of the condition of industry, that's creating a new connection between the observer and that part of the environment. And Gideon writes that this is why we still need artists, however difficult it may be for them to hold their place in the modern world. So at that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you, Chantel. Really a lot to think about. I think now we can take questions from the audience. People can type them into the chat if there are questions, and then I'll read them out. Before we do that, I guess I had a sort of question about Ernesto Rogers and his relationship to Zanuso and Mangiarotti. Would you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Sure. So it's interesting. It's an interesting question. Well, Rogers was somewhat older than Zanuso, so he and the other members of his firm BBPR graduated from the Milan Polytechnic, I think in 1932. So he was a kind of role model for Zanuso. And the Second World War caused them to disperse to some extent. Zanuso was in the Navy. Rogers spent some time in exile in Switzerland. And a couple of members, actually one member, Banfi of BBPR, was sent to Mauthausen and died in the concentration camp, along with Giuseppe Pagano, another key figure in modern architecture in the 1930s. And so if you look up BBPR and you see sometimes it's BPR, sometimes it's BBPR, it's because Banfi sadly died, but they decided to keep the B, but not everybody observed that after the war. So anyway, Rogers was a very literary kind of architect. He wrote theory, he wrote editorials in magazines. So he edited Domus for 2 years after it's 1946, 1947. Zanuso was one of his sub-editors. There was one for prefabrication, one for industrial design, that was Alberto Rosselli. And other topics as well. So he had this sort of phalanx of editors, and Zanuso was the technology prefabrication person. But Zanuso was not a kind of thoughtful, reflective writerly type of architect. He wrote, but his writings were tended to be more pragmatic. Now, I'm not going to go all professorial and just start talking about these guys, but it's only by like extreme force of effort. But to answer your question, Rogers was a leader in the Movimento di Studi di Architettura, the sort of architects cultural group in Milan after the war. He was editor of Domus, and then in 1954 relaunched Casabella as Casabella Continuità, again writing editorials and kind of setting the drumbeat in a sense for that avant-garde, such as they were. And Zanuso was his deputy in a sense. But at 1957, for various reasons, that group kind of dispersed, and Zanuso went his own way. And in a way, that's when it's actually becomes really important to be able to talk about Zanuso's work, because that's when it's no longer, you can no longer just sort of assimilate it directly to the Rogers project. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it's obviously a difficult question to answer. So.
Well, Mangiarotti, on the other hand, was, Zanuso started his practice after Second World War, but the cultural ties still bound him somewhat to that older pre-war generation, even though he was running around with the younger groups of Gregotti, who was even younger, born in 1921, just like Mangiarotti, and sadly died just this year in March. Gregoti started writing, like trying to chronicle, like he's like trying to put everything together. Like, let's see, like there's this generation, there's that generation, and trying to put people in place and trying to assess, like, how are we doing? He would go on like that right up until the 1980s, or writing endless chronicles and trying, like, correcting himself. And so he's another extremely interesting figure.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we do have some questions and comments. Ed Ford writes in, great lecture on Two Neglected Masters. And from Robert McCarter, we have many thanks for your excellent lecture. I'm wondering if the issue is the difference between collage and figure or collage and synthesis. Both projects and design processes are composed of distinct characteristic elements.
That's a good question. Synthesis, it could be. It could be. I think that's definitely something that I will consider. I think the reason I'm drawn to figure is because of the H, the parabola, the shapes of things in Mangiarotti's design world are so, it's not the machine age Platonism of the circle and Platonic geometry, but are also not kind of whatever shape it happens to be. I think one of the reasons that Zanuso is not written about more is that his buildings are not pretty in the sense that I think Mangiarotti's are, like that the smooth forms, the sort of recognizable figure, like the H, they, to my mind, make his buildings more approachable. And I think to some people they would say that they're sort of better designs because, but then on the other hand, I think Zanuso he was that kind of personality that did not want to turn back from what was difficult. And I think that shows in the project as well, these projects that have this heterogeneity. So I suppose I would say the counter question would be, well, would you not say that there is a synthesis in both cases as well?
Now, maybe we can have a panel on this. We have another question here from Constance Vale. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Chantel. What do you think Zanuso, Mangiarotti, and your analysis of them offer designers in the present? Do you consider figurality, collage, and close reading as having ongoing relevance today?
Wow, that's a great question. I guess my answer is yes, but also that the most important thing for me is that we need to keep looking at architecture. That sounds kind of sort of glib, but I think we need to look at it and see and sort of voice what is there. It's the alternative, I think, would be to not, it's to like accept what a project is, how a project is presented, and think of the built thing as kind of a kind of illustration of the word in a way. Whereas I think that keeps you from understanding architecture. Whereas if you do this sort of close reading, I think you're forced to look at, well, how does this thing go together? There was a moment when I was presenting my dissertation, which was on Zanuso, and someone said, you know, that circular driveway right there, what do you make of that? And it was just kind of like, it seemed like that was like a place where he had just made a circular driveway. And I think it's important to see, like, well, that's not really, okay, let's just admit that's not the most inspired part of the project. But we need to see, like, where there is inspiration and where the projects go dead a little bit. And I think that the significance of that for now is that today, okay, I'm going to make an actual coherent point here. when Julia Veronese wrote about Mangiarotti, one of the things the problem she said that he was working on was how to create projects out of prefabricated parts, which for her meant cast in series on site, because she understood or believed in 1963 that this new world of building was going to be whatever it was going to be. It was going to be industrialized. It was going to be prefabricated and so forth. And so that was the architects believed that they would be the ones to solve that problem. But in reality, and this will vary from country to country, but certainly in the US, architects are not designing their beams necessarily. Their beams might be pieces of steel that come from somewhere, or wooden joists or something. Or they might have a design and they go to the contractor and the contractor says, well, for this price, I only build with this system. So this condition of having to create a synthesis or a figure or a collage is still real for architects now. And I guess that's why I think these architects have something that architects today can learn from. Because so how did they get around having to deal with a certain construction assembly and so forth?
Great. Okay, I think we have to wrap up. Thank you, Chantel. Incredibly thoughtful and carefully researched, and we're all very happy that you're here as part of this faculty. So
thank you so much, Eric, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks for everyone for tuning in. Good night.